Hey guys, tonight we have something gently unusual for you. It's the story of a week in history where almost nothing happened, and that's precisely what makes it worth remembering. Soldiers stood in damp fields, waiting for orders that never came. But there were no secret troops, no distractions. Just a man quietly putting on a pair of walking shoes and stepping away from the center of everything. "He's up to something," they muttered. "He must be." He watched through the small window, not with the gaze of a commander, but with the tired curiosity of someone learning how to see again. A land of soft hills, quiet canals, and streets that didn't rush. He had passed through it before, during louder years, but never stopped to notice it. This time, he meant to notice. Not to lead, not to change, not to command. Just to be there. The town he chose was Bruges, a place where time seemed to breathe slower, and even the cobblestones felt too polite to echo footsteps too loudly. Things like, "Today the clouds didn't argue," or "The bread here tastes slightly of almonds." Small thoughts that weren't meant to be remembered. Sometimes he didn't write at all. Some days passed like wind through tall, grass-whispered, unmeasured, and entirely unremarkable. Enough to remind him that the world did not always need movement. That value could live quietly, in the spaces between achievements. That tulips opened whether or not they were watched. And that sometimes, doing nothing was its own kind of rare accomplishment. A victory too soft to write down, but not too soft to feel. The trees blurred gently past. The sky remained gray and undecided. Villages came and went. He did not count miles. He did not count days. The shutters rattled when the breeze slipped in from the north. At night, the canal below reflected street lamps like flickering dreams. There was nothing urgent in any of it. No symbolism. No metaphor. Just quiet spaces, cool air, and a bed that never expected to host an emperor. Imagine a week where history sighed and closed its eyes. Where a man who had once stirred continents sat beside a teapot and let the world go on without him. And in doing so, found something more precious than power. He found silence. And in that silence, perhaps, a glimpse of peace. It had creaky wooden floors, lace curtains, and a view of nothing important. There was no staff, no advisors, no guards at the door. He bought his bread each morning from a shop 2 blocks away. The baker never recognized him. Or if she did, she said nothing. She wrapped the loaf in brown paper and gave a small nod. He liked that. He liked being someone no one expected anything from. Someone who could walk slowly without being followed by history. He brewed weak tea, let it cool too long, and drank it anyway. He went for short walks that had no purpose. He stared at ducks. He watched laundry dry in neighboring yards. And sometimes, when the afternoon sun slid along the table just right, he sat in complete stillness, not thinking of anything, not needing to explain himself to anyone at all. Just a kettle on the stove, a window that opened with effort, and a chair by the fire that had likely belonged to someone's grandmother. It was perfect in the way quiet things sometimes are so unremarkable that they become unforgettable. He simply let the journey happen, without needing to arrive. They imagined coded signals, hidden plans, or meetings in far-off taverns. Soldiers drilled in muddy fields. Foreign envoys sent letters of concern. But there was nothing to be concerned about. Napoleon wasn't plotting anything. He wasn't waiting to return with a bold idea. He was simply enjoying the strange, almost absurd sensation of having nothing to do. But none of that was true. Napoleon had no destination of strategic importance. He simply wanted peace. For a little while, he didn't ask permission. He didn't make a speech. He left the palace through a side door, with no fanfare, and disappeared into a waiting carriage. For once, he carried no maps, no swords, no instructions for anyone. Only a book he likely wouldn't read, a scarf in case of wind, and a few linen napkins tucked in beside his gloves. Every eye, it seemed, was on Napoleon, waiting for his next move, his next war, his next reason to make the ground tremble. But behind closed doors, Napoleon wasn't drafting plans. He wasn't plotting new campaigns. He was folding shirts, selecting a travel coat, and preparing a small bag for an entirely different kind of journey. In the spring of 1809, while much of Europe braced itself for war, Napoleon Bonaparte, emperor, strategist, and the man whose footsteps had shaken entire kingdoms, quietly made a decision. Not to fight, not to plan, not even to speak. He decided to take a vacation, a real one. And in doing so, he left the world briefly suspended in a kind of puzzled silence. At the time, the continent felt like it was on the verge of unraveling. Maps were redrawn almost weekly. Cities whispered rumors of invasion. He said very little before he left. Some thought he was ill. Others assumed it was a ruse, a trick to distract while troops moved in secret. The palace staff was unsure how to react. Ministers whispered in corners. Generals shuffled papers. As the horses trotted along quiet roads, the empire he had shaped continued spinning, puzzled and restless. His destination, though he hadn't told anyone, was Belgium. In Bruges, he rented a small house by a canal. Each morning, he woke when the light reached his pillow. Back in Paris, there was confusion. The cabinet met daily, debating how long his absence could last before the public grew uneasy. He wrote a little. Not speeches, not policy. Just a few lines now and then, in a soft leather-bound notebook he'd found on a kitchen shelf. The house made small noises. The stairs creaked when no one was on them. There were no visits, no celebrations. No journalists arrived. He made no proclamations. And so the days passed. Not many, just enough to feel different. So tonight, as you drift toward rest, let this story guide you, not with noise, not with tension, but with a whisper of stillness. The moment arrived without announcement, but it carried an odd sense of finality. Napoleon, who had orchestrated so many sweeping campaigns, simply said it aloud one morning. He would go to Belgium, and he would do nothing. Those closest to him heard the words, but could not grasp them. It was as if someone had placed a feather in the center of a map full of cannons. He did not offer more explanation. There was no speech, no note of urgency, no final directive. They held scheduled meetings, took official minutes, and reviewed matters of state. Yet everything felt strangely hollow. Without the emperor's energy, the rhythm faltered. Ministers debated imaginary threats, filling their time with outlines and models that no longer had urgency. Some assumed that surely, at any moment, a letter would arrive revealing the true purpose behind his absence. But none came. Just the quiet decision to stop, to pause, to step away from the storm he had built. Russia wondered if he had simply vanished. But as no battles followed and no fresh alliances were struck, a strange thing happened. Tension gave way to pause. There was no signal to move forward, no reason to escalate. He noticed trees in bloom, roofs streaked with moss, rivers that curled gently through farmland. The innkeeper did not recognize him, or at least made no mention if she did. The wooden floor creaked as she walked, and the chairs seemed just a little too low for comfort. He did not mind. There was something comforting in the ordinary slowness of it all. He lingered over his tea until it cooled, and watched steam rise, then fade. He looked out not as a planner, but as an observer. The road required nothing of him, and he required nothing in return. It was perhaps the first journey in which every mile was simply allowed to be what it was. In time, envoys simply waited, watching the days stack up without consequence. Regiments stood by, waiting for orders that did not arrive. Budgets were reviewed and stamps affixed, but the halls echoed more loudly than before. Without decisions flowing from the center, everyone held their breath. Even the palace seemed to relax. Curtains were opened more often. Fires were let burn lower in the evenings. It was not a capital. It held no royal palaces or barracks. Its canals moved in lazy loops, and its churches rang bells more out of tradition than precision. That was where he was going. Not to hide, not to strategize, but to rest. He had chosen it not for any importance, but because it felt forgotten. And to be forgotten, if only for a little while, was all he truly desired. A peculiar kind of peace took hold, soft and tentative. Could observe the wind mean something about troop movements? What began as a single soldier mending his socks became a quiet pastime shared among many. Scarves and mittens appeared on barracks' windowsills. Even a woolen banner was stitched together, bearing no emblem but waves and wind. Elsewhere, near a woodland outpost, a quartet of soldiers gathered nightly to play borrowed instruments. They had never practiced music before, but they did not mind the off notes. Their melodies wandered like breeze through trees. Was there an encrypted order somewhere within the phrasing? But rereading it offered no clues. Letters home no longer described the edges of battle or the pace of marching, but instead spoke of weather, of dreams, of the sound of birds in morning fog. One soldier wrote, "We are still in uniform, but we are no longer moving. It feels like we have stepped sideways out of history." These were not records of action, but reflections of presence. It seemed, frustratingly and bewilderingly, to mean exactly what it said, and in time they began to believe it. The war machine, long whirring without pause, began to idle. Boots remained polished but unmoved. Rifles were inspected, then shelved. Days passed. A letter did eventually come, but it bore no new instructions. It was addressed to no one in particular, though its handwriting was unmistakable. "There are no campaigns. I am resting. Remain at ease. Observe the wind." That was all it said. It was posted without haste and received without knowing what to do with it. In the imperial court, silence quickly gave way to speculation. Ministers exchanged glances. Advisers consulted their notes. Generals stared at maps, wondering if perhaps this vacation was some elaborate strategic maneuver. They whispered about diversionary tactics and symbolic positioning. What if Belgium was merely the first domino? What if troops would quietly follow? But the emperor had packed no orders, issued no commands. His intentions were softer than they could comprehend. He was tired, and he needed something that could not be fought for something slower. Instead of dispatching scouts or envoys, he packed a simple travel bag. He selected 2 coats, both weathered but warm, and a pair of boots that no longer shined. He left quietly through a side entrance, as if he were an ordinary man returning a borrowed book. His coachman, half unsure whether this was real, kept looking over his shoulder as they rolled away. But there were no pursuers, no drumbeats, just the sound of horseshoes tapping gently against stones and the slow creak of leather straps adjusting with each turn in the road. Into the side pouch went a small packet of herbs, the kind used to steep calming tea. He paused at the sight of old campaign maps, but he left them behind. There would be no surveying, no sketching of routes or placements, just walking, resting, observing things that had long been pushed to the far edges of his life. His departure did not resemble any journey he had made before. There was no ceremony, no mounted escort. Back at the palace, the vacuum left behind created waves. The inner council tried to maintain structure. The military, trained to expect motion, found the stillness confusing. At first, the generals studied the message for hidden meanings. One infantry division, stationed near the coast, took up knitting. The absence of purpose gave rise to quiet oddities. Some troops began journaling for the first time. Meanwhile, diplomats across Europe scrambled for answers. Rumors flew across borders. Austria thought perhaps Napoleon had fallen ill. Britain assumed it was a deception. The French cabinet continued to meet, their pens scratching over documents, that no longer seemed urgent. And still, Napoleon traveled slowly toward Belgium. His carriage passed hills that once marked routes of campaign, now softened by mist and green. At a roadside inn, he ate broth beside a fire, alone. Somewhere past the forests, past the murmured questions of Europe's courts, was a small town called Bruges. Bruges greeted him without ceremony. No banners, no fanfare, no curious crowds. The cobbled streets remained unchanged by his arrival, and the canal waters kept their slow, silent pace. The shutters didn't quite close, and the door swelled when it rained. Inside, the furniture was old but solid. He walked without direction, simply moving through the sleepy lanes and over stone bridges. He passed windows lined with tulips in clay pots and laundry swaying in a light breeze. The church bells rang in the distance, their tone mellow and without urgency. Once, he fixed a loose hinge on the front door, though it continued to creak in protest. He found a bench beneath a tree and sat for what might have been an hour or more. Pigeons gathered near his feet, and he offered them crumbs from a biscuit he had saved from breakfast. The sky was a soft, steady gray. He tilted his head back and let his eyes close, not to sleep, but simply to drift. He noticed the sound the kettle made just before it whistled, things his mother might have sung while stirring a pot. He ate it slowly on a bench beside the canal. A man passed with a fishing rod over his shoulder. A dog barked once, then stopped. Somewhere, unseen, a woman sang while scrubbing a rug. It was not a remarkable day, but in its plainness, it offered something he could not name, something his old life had rarely allowed, melodies that meant warmth and closeness, not conquest. He didn't notice when these sounds left his mouth. His footsteps fell quieter on the floorboards. He opened doors with care. He no longer reached for his journal out of habit. The days instead recorded themselves, not in ink or parchment, but in the memory of warm bread, of folded towels, of sun fallen through dust. Nothing asked to be remembered, and so it all stayed with him in the gentlest way. They floated into the house like another guest, unannounced and unbothered. The walls accepted them, as they accepted everything else, quietly. He observed how the light shifted along the kitchen wall at different hours. These were not lessons, not symbols, just moments. And for the first time in many seasons, he allowed moments to be enough. A boy chased a wooden hoop along a wall. A woman fed ducks without looking up. Nothing paused for him. And that, perhaps, was the point. It was not a message, just a market flyer listing the week's produce. Strawberries, honey, cabbage. The flames flickered in the old hearth, casting shadows across the beams. The house creaked gently as it cooled. Once he lit a candle and watched its flame stretch and lean in the breath of the room. He found comfort in that tiny light, dancing for no one in particular, not signaling, not guiding, just being there. The ordinary made quietly beautiful. He pinned it to the wall beside the cupboard and smiled to himself. About horses standing idle, letters unopened, men waiting for instruction that would never arrive. He didn't dwell on it. He didn't worry. That life, for now, was paused, and he was not so sure it needed resuming. The idea of decisions, of declarations and consequences, seemed distant. Instead, there was a bowl of soup cooling on the table, and a breeze pushing softly at the curtain. In a past life, every slip of paper had meant orders, logistics, battle plans. Now it meant jam, soup, and something to look forward to on Thursday morning. A faded chair sat near the window, patched at the arms where time had worn it soft. A loaf of dark bread, a wedge of pale cheese, and a small tin of preserved pears. No one asked his name. The vendors smiled politely, counted out change, and returned to folding cloth or arranging baskets. It was as if the town had decided he could be anyone, and in doing so, made him someone he hadn't been in years, invisible, quiet, ordinary, The kitchen smelled faintly of lavender and bread. He found an old iron kettle tucked into the cupboard, slightly dented but serviceable. The water boiled slowly, and he listened to the gentle rattle of the lid. He sat by the window with the cup cupped in both hands. Across the canal, a woman hung sheets from a window, and their corners lifted slightly in the breeze. He did not take notes. There were no maps spread across the table. Only the warmth of tea, the scent of mint, and a cat somewhere outside, meowing in the distance. There were no portraits, no reminders of greatness. Just quiet, useful things that didn't care who he was. The wind whispered gently between gables and narrow alleys. This was a place that had never rushed, never chased history, and now that history had arrived, it simply carried on with its quiet rhythm. Napoleon, stepping down from the modest carriage, looked around at the sleepy charm and felt, for once, unimportant. And that was strangely welcome. He had rented a small house near one of the outer canals. His first morning began with stillness. He bought food from the market, just as the town clock struck 9. Back in the kitchen, he brewed tea from a handful of herbs he couldn't name. Days passed in this gentle rhythm. He cooked simple meals and swept the wooden floor. One afternoon, he wandered farther than usual, past a chapel with ivy growing up its walls. On his return, he found a slip of paper under his door. In the evenings, he often sat by the fire with a blanket pulled around his shoulders. He thought, now and then, about the world beyond this town. Sometimes he hummed, not songs of glory or marsh, but half-remembered tunes from long ago. On the 5th morning, he walked to a bakery and bought a croissant that flaked in his hands. By the end of the week, he had learned to move more softly. The letter arrived without ceremony. It bore the emperor's seal, but the parchment was folded with an absent-minded hand. No officer delivered it with urgency. No trumpet announced its presence. It simply appeared, as if the wind had placed it gently atop the desk. In the war rooms, silence replaced debate. Some assumed this was misdirection, a play to confuse enemies. But eventually, they ran out of things to do. Restless energy settled into a quiet discomfort, like a song that ends too soon. A broken flute, once packed away for a soldier's daughter, was mended with thread and tape. Its sound was uncertain at first, full of wheezes and wandering notes. Blacksmiths found time to mend tools with unusual care, etching small patterns into the handles. Laundry was done more often, hung in neat rows that fluttered like flags of peace. It was not marked by a trumpet call or a formal change of duty. It simply happened, like sleep. One day, the encampments no longer felt temporary. They hung them on the branches of a leaning tree, just beyond the officers' quarters. When the breeze moved through, the sound was delicate, hesitant, like a conversation between raindrops. No one claimed responsibility, but no one removed them either. And that, perhaps, was a kind of peace they had never trained for. It became a small part of camp life, singing softly at dusk. Some men began to sleep closer to the sound, finding the chimes comforting in the night. Tents were reinforced, not for battle, but for comfort. Not of glory or grief, but of shadows and tea, of hands warmed by fire, of the scent of earth before rain. His verses were shared by word of mouth, passed along between tents like quiet stories. They brought a stillness that felt different from boredom. It was not absence. It was something whole. Each poem became a lullaby for the weary, a way of naming the slow days. Campfires grew slower. Conversations wandered. Even silence, once filled with tension, began to feel companionable. When letters from home arrived, they were read aloud and shared like treasures. The sharpness of routine faded into something rounder, slower, softer. Others suspected illness, betrayal, or something stranger still. But while suspicion circled, nothing materialized. Borders remained untested, alliances unchallenged. The war, it seemed, had misplaced itself. Cartographers sat idle, their ink drying beside blank maps. Its edges curled with time. Some still stopped to read it, as if clarity might appear with enough repetition. But most had stopped wondering. They had, in their way, obeyed. They had sat still. They had felt the wind. And in doing so, they found themselves somewhere new. Soldiers took turns planting herbs around the camp's edges, and soon patches of green appeared where once there was only trampled earth. But in time, a rhythm found its place. Drums fashioned from old crates joined in, along with a borrowed fiddle. Drills gave way to walks, and then to quiet hours under trees. A general known for his temper took up bird watching. He kept a list in a small leather book, and spoke less each day. In the absence of tasks, listening became a form of leadership, and without objectives, presence became its own kind of order. Some commanders began reading aloud in the evenings, old stories and strange fables, just to hear a voice in the dusk. Evenings stretched longer now, and around small fires, soldiers swayed gently to half-remembered songs. The melodies were imperfect, but no one seemed to mind. Laughter began to punctuate the songs, soft and spontaneous. A few senior officers continued to draft reports, but they were filed into drawers no one opened. Some soldiers drew sketches of clouds. Others brewed tea with mint from nearby gardens. A few learned to cook beyond what rations demanded, turning onions and salt into something almost tender. With no battles to train for, they turned their attention to moments, to sounds, to the slow change of daylight across canvas walls. One group created a daily contest of identifying bird calls by sound alone. The routine, so long bound to movement, began to soften. Some soldiers began measuring the shadow of their tents at different times of the day, charting how the sun made patterns in the dust. But no further letters followed. No ships changed course. No drums beat in the distance. Days passed. Then a week. And still, the only sound was the occasional breeze pressing against tent flaps and the faint whistle of kettles left too long on the fire. The quiet was no longer something they waded through. It became something they entered. A single sheet, no more than a few lines. The generals opened it expecting strategy, timing, perhaps a map drawn in haste. His grandmother had taught him once, and he remembered enough fumble through a few rows. By the third day, others noticed. But instead of laughter, there was interest. A sergeant joined him, and two more. Within a week, a group gathered each afternoon, their fingers looping wool with unexpected grace. Scarves and mittens appeared like quiet declarations, not of war, but of waiting. Someone started teaching embroidery, and suddenly sleeves carried small, stitched flowers. Instead, they read the message twice, then once more, before realizing there was no mistake. There are no campaigns. I am resting. Remain at ease. Observe the wind. It was not a code. It held no hidden coordinates, no cleverly phrased instruction. In the absence of command, the army hesitated. They cleaned their boots. They sharpened their tools. They counted supplies and rearranged crates. One morning, a junior officer took up knitting. It began in secret, behind a row of stacked barrels. At another post, music began. The stillness gave rise to small rituals. Boots polished in the morning sun. Letters written not to report, but to reflect. The horses grew calmer. Once restless before marshes, they now stood quietly near watering troughs, their tails swishing in unhurried arcs. Commanders, though puzzled, began to understand. They stopped shouting. Maps remained rolled. No one could say when it shifted from waiting to resting. Across the continent, whispers of confusion drifted between capitals. Spies returned with nothing to report. Envoys speculated over the lack of motion. Some believed Napoleon had vanished. Back at the front, a group of soldiers built wind chimes from cutlery and spare buttons. A poet among the infantry, long silent, began to write again. The emperor's letter remained pinned to a post in the main tent, not on a battlefield, not in a victory, but in a moment that did not demand anything of them. A morning sun rose without drama. It crept slowly over the clay-tiled roofs and stretched long golden arms across the cobbled streets. Birds stirred in the hedges, their calls unhurried. From the back door to the garden gate, and then back again. 21 steps one way, 21 steps the other, 42 steps in total. It became a loop, repeated with no urgency. His mind, once sharp and restless with campaigns and formations, now counted nothing but the birds in the hedge and the shapes of passing clouds. Each step was not toward anything, but a soft moment unfolding. He walked through fields of cabbage, row upon row stretching beyond the horizon. When he awoke, the sun had shifted. Shadows leaned in the opposite direction. The tulips continued their gentle sway. He opened to a clean page. The pencil moved slowly, forming lines without flourish. He yawned, the sound soft, like cloth brushing wood. Then he reached into his pocket for the small leather-bound book he carried. The house held the scent of tea and wood smoke. He boiled water, sliced bread, and spread jam on a plate with quiet precision. There was pleasure in the rhythm of these tasks. A few petals had fallen onto the path, forming a kind of silent procession. As the air cooled, he wrapped the shawl around his shoulders once more. And when morning returned, he would wake not with urgency, but with quiet. A man, once emperor, learning again the shape of ordinary time. In this garden, on this quiet street, he had taken 42 steps and found something greater than victory, the space to simply be. The cat from the morning had reappeared, curling into a coil of sleep on the garden wall. He did not disturb it. There was wisdom in sleep, and even more wisdom in letting it be. A kind of ceremony in the ordinary. When he sat down to eat, he did so slowly, but of 42 steps, of time and tulips, of a dream made only of cabbage. He understood, dimly, that these details might one day vanish, that no history book would mark this day. But in his bones something softened, something let go. And for the first time in many years, sleep came before thought had the chance to interfere, not out of exhaustion, but from a desire to notice every flavor. Each bite was a deliberate act, as if nourishing something more than just the body. A man between moments, no longer pulled by glory, not yet returned to duty. A figure seated beneath flowering branches, learning how to be still. And in that stillness, he felt not diminished, but restored. A habit from his years on campaign, now repurposed for gentler reflections. There was no symbolism, no message, just cabbage. A farmer waved from afar, but no words passed between them. The field was quiet, and the quiet felt kind. It was a strange sort of peace, not empty, but full of still life. In the small house on the edge of Bruges, the former emperor of France, now just a solitary figure wrapped in a wool shawl, stepped out into the garden. There was no ceremony. No guards, no trumpets, no footsteps echoing behind him. It moved from blossom to blossom, careful, patient. But there were daisies on the table and warmth in the sun. He watched it for longer than he might have watched a battlefield. The tiny rhythm of its flight felt like instruction. Move gently, take only what is needed, linger where the world offers sweetness. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, perhaps a church, perhaps a bicycle. He did not check. Let it ring. Let the world spin on in its quiet revolutions. The moment was enough. This table, this cup of tea, this crumb of bread on his finger. And though the world beyond might press on with urgency, within this small home, time walked barefoot. He found himself quietly admiring its purpose, its absence of hurry. Just the soft hush of dew-laced grass beneath his boots, and the gentle welcome of a day with no expectations. He had no destination, not really, but he felt the need to walk, if only to feel the weight of his body in motion. A neighbor's cat watched from atop a fence post. It blinked slowly, unbothered, before returning to its nap. The garden was modest, a patch of soft dirt, some herbs growing in irregular rows, a bench made from weathered wood. The shawl fell from his lap and curled slightly at the corners. His hands, once used to signing orders and tracing the lines of Europe, lay still on his lap. At some point, perhaps on the 5th or 6th circuit, he noticed a small bee hovering near the thyme. By midday, the sun had warmed the bench. He sat down, letting his shoulders relax against the backrest. Its pages were mostly empty. Once intended for strategic notes, now it held scattered thoughts. Today, I won nothing. I conquered no city, claimed no crown. He closed the book without rereading. That was enough. There was no audience, no need for perfection. The garden accepted him as he was. Later, he walked inside, his steps soft on the worn floorboards. Outside, a breeze passed through the window and stirred the edge of a curtain. He returned to the bench just before dusk. The sky deepened, tinged with the softness of late-day light. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought not of Europe or conquest. He did not dream of battles. He dreamed of still water, of clouds moving across a wide sky. He dreamed of silence that felt full. The morning unfolded like a page turned slowly, the corner soft and the print fading. The sunlight moved gently across the walls of the small study, warming the dust motes that hovered in still air. Inside, he sat at a small desk, once used for correspondence and plans, now cleared of everything but a blank sheet of paper and a stub of pencil. There were no maps here, no declarations, just the echo of thought waiting to find shape. It was quiet, not the tense silence before decisions, but the kind that comes from being deeply alone and deeply untroubled. He stared at the page. It reminded him of a continent yet unnamed, an expanse of potential that asked for neither conquest nor defense. He sliced a pear, arranged it beside a piece of bread, and poured tea into a chipped cup. The map waited, silent and unchanged, as he ate slowly, watching the breeze tug at the curtain. A leaf landed just outside the window and spun for a moment before settling. He smiled at it, then returned to his seat. A new mark on the map, the spot where the leaf had landed. On it, he wrote a single line. Perhaps the world does not need another map. Or not. It did not matter. Outside, the tulips nodded gently. The garden gate creaked once and then was still. Inside, the house held its breath, the quiet undisturbed. And in the center of it all sat a man, content not to go anywhere, because he had already arrived. The journey, it turned out, had taken no steps at all, only the courage to remain still and let the moment open like a door. There was no flourish to the script, no intent to impress. It was simply a thought, placed into the world like a feather laid on water. He labeled it, in thought alone, as the place of brief dances. He drew a line, just one, a wandering arc that curved from the lower left to the top right. There could be a mark for the quiet between two bells in the distance. Just a single sheet of a world that did not need to be conquered to be understood. Not far, not fast, just enough to notice the tilt of light, the low hum of bees in the hedge, the creak of wood settling beneath him. The house, small and simple, felt vast in its familiarity. Every corner now carried a meaning unrelated to ambition. There were no victories here, no defeats, only spaces. Quiet, subtle spaces that asked nothing of him but attention. He folded it carefully, once, then twice, and placed it between the pages of a book on herbal remedies. It would not be used again, and that was fine. It had already done what it needed to do. It had shown him that there were spaces worth marking that could never be marched upon. A symbol for the place where the smell of bread first met the morning air. He considered drawing a little square to represent the silence that came before a breeze. But now the opposite seemed true. The point was not fixed. It drifted with the wind, with scent, with the angle of light. And instead of moving toward it, he remained still and let it arrive. This, too, was a kind of journey. A deeper one, perhaps. One that led not to a place, but to a feeling. There was so much to notice. And in noticing, he discovered a strange peace. Then another, looping around a spot where a drop of tea had once stained the wood. There were no labels, no borders. Just shapes, mountains suggested by gentle humps, rivers implied by wavering curls. A map, perhaps, but not of land. A map of stillness. He added an X in the upper corner and labeled it quietly in his mind. The place where afternoon light lands on the armchair. Another mark near the bottom edge. The view from the window where birds gather. Inside, the map grew, not outward, but inward, and sees arrows for armies, red circles for battles yet to come. They were tools of action, instruments of certainty. But this one, the one before him now, was something else entirely. It did not call for movement. It asked only to be seen. And so he looked, and he drew, and with each line he found himself resting more deeply in the chair, more fully in the moment. Each addition was a memory, a sensation, a moment captured without intention. The place where the floorboard creaks when he steps to the kitchen, the shadow on the windowsill at noon, the patch of warmth on the garden bench just before sunset. None of these places could be found on any official chart, yet all of them were known to him. A triangle, the exact spot where the scent of rosemary is strongest when the wind turns just right. It became a game, a cartography of comfort. No compass rose, no legends of kings, just the soft geometry of presence. This was a map made not for travel, but for appreciation. The hours passed without notice. Outside, the sky stretched pale and endless. He thought briefly of the maps he had once followed, crisp, urgent lines drawn in ink with names of cities at lunch. He left the map on the desk. He began to realize how many things could be mapped if one only changed the idea of what maps were for. By mid-afternoon, he had filled the page. It was not crowded, but complete in a quiet way. No edges, no frame. Later, as the shadows grew long, he sat by the window and let his thoughts wander. He remembered something from long ago, a lesson in navigation, perhaps. That one must fix a point and move toward it. In the fading light, he took another sheet of paper. He left it on the desk, unweighted, so the breeze might carry it somewhere. The morning arrived gently, the way a soft cloth falls over a table. The sky outside remained a pale gray, with the promise of neither rain nor brilliance, just a hushed quiet that seemed to fold over the rooftops like a wool blanket. In the kitchen, he stood still for a while, letting the kettle whistle once before lifting it from the flame. There was no schedule for the day, no letters to sign, no messengers awaiting instruction. Only the lingering impression of a conversation at the market, an elderly woman mistaking him for a visiting chef from Lyon, requesting one of his famous chocolate cakes for the upcoming fair. He had not corrected her, not out of amusement, but from a gentle curiosity that had begun to settle into his days like dust on a windowsill. The smell of chocolate spread through the air like a slow exhale. It was not the scent of victory, but something warmer, something that asked nothing of him. Outside, the tulips barely swayed, and a cat passed silently beneath the window. She arrived with a basket of pears and a folded apron. She seemed pleased, not by the quality of the cake, but by the simple fact that he had made it. She took a piece, wrapped the rest, and left behind a quiet hum in the air. There were no battle lines to chart, no proclamations to draft. Only a small sentence formed in his mind, calm and certain. He wrote it carefully and closed the book, letting the pencil rest beside it. Sometimes it asked only for a small effort, a quiet attempt, a willingness to be present. And in this simple act, without judgment or reward, he found something he had not expected. He found peace. His fingers were still dusted with flour, and the faint scent of sugar clung to his sleeves. On the table, the pears waited in their basket, their skin dappled, their shapes uneven. Just like the cake, they were enough. Bell rang faintly in the distance, its tone carried by the breeze. He did not look at the clock. There was no need. The moments were full, not because of what was happening, but because of what was not. He brushed the crumbs from the windowsill, letting them fall to the ground below. Perhaps a bird would find them, or perhaps the wind would carry them elsewhere. The world did not take notice of his baking. That, in itself, felt like a gift. The pans had cooled. The air held a sweet softness. He sat by the window again, not to reflect, but simply to be. The tulips leaned toward the fading sun, and a quiet calm settled over everything. There were no cheers, no fanfare. No one would remember the cake in any record or chronicle. But it had been made, and that, today, was enough. It was a curiosity that no longer demanded answers, only presence. It leaned slightly to one side. A crack had formed near the center. Still, it held together. He placed it on the windowsill to cool, watching the steam rise in thin ribbons before vanishing into the stillness. He poured another cup of tea and sliced a small piece of the cake for himself. It was dense, a little bitter, and uneven in texture. Rarely had he tasted anything fully. The food had often been fuel, consumed for function. But now, his imperfect slice of cake held more meaning than any feast. It was made by his own hands. It was flawed. And it was real. Still, it was undeniably a cake. He chewed slowly, not searching for flavor, but letting it arrive on its own. For once, he was not eating in preparation for something. He was just eating. It was not perfect. And that felt perfectly fine. So it was that on this quiet morning, with no recipe and only a vague memory of ingredients, he prepared to bake. The butter melted steadily in a pan that held stories of past breakfasts and modest dinners. When he stirred in the chocolate, its scent rose like memory, dark and rich and warming. The act of mixing became its own kind of rhythm, a gentle, repetitive motion that felt neither rushed nor expected. The kitchen was small but dependable, filled with modest tools and the comfort of simplicity. Flour, sifted from a brown paper sack, left a soft coating on the wood grain of the counter. Chocolate bars, purchased the day before, sat beside eggs and butter with quiet anticipation. He laid each ingredient out slowly, not with the haste of duty, but the care of attention, as though arranging pieces for a puzzle that didn't need solving. The eggs cracked open with a small echoing sound, shells collected in a worn bowl. Sugar spilled, and he left it there. The granules scattered across the wood like tiny crystals, unnecessary to gather. There was no one to judge the precision of his baking, and no medals to earn. He turned on the oven, its familiar groan rising like an old sigh. The batter, thick and imperfect, was poured into a round tin and slid carefully into the oven's uneven warmth. There was no ceremony, only quiet. He sat by the kitchen table as the cake baked, hands loose in his lap, gaze resting on the steam that curled up from his tea. When the oven door opened, the cake looked neither impressive nor disappointing. The woman who had made the request appeared later that morning. The scent of chocolate lingered long after she had gone. It clung to the air and softened the edges of the afternoon. He considered the countless meals of his past banquets, held under chandeliers, hurried rations eaten beside tents, quiet breakfasts interrupted by news of movement. Later, he opened his notebook and paused before writing. The hours passed gently, marked only by the slow turn of light on the kitchen floor. As evening approached, the kitchen returned to its earlier stillness. In the deepening quiet, he understood that greatness did not always require grandeur. The day unfolded with the softness of a woolen scarf being unwound in the morning light. The breeze that drifted in through the open window was cool but not biting, tinged faintly with the smell of tulip leaves and distant chimney smoke. They were not hurried steps, no scramble or desperation, just the light, deliberate rhythm of small feet crossing the garden path. He looked up from his tea and saw a gray cat standing just outside the door, tail poised like a punctuation mark. It came in the mornings, and sometimes again in the late afternoon, never meowing, never insisting. It would curl into a circle by the windowsill, or perch on the fence, tail flicking gently, eyes half-lidded in contemplation. He began to call it Pierre, not aloud, but in his notes. The cat sniffed the milk, then, uninterested, turned and stared into the distance. The loose outline of Pierre in 3 poses, stretched, curled, alert. The drawings were imperfect, the proportions slightly off, but they felt honest. He tucked the sketches into his journal without comment. It felt good to make something that had no goal. The strokes were slow, his pencil deliberate, echoing the unhurried tempo of the house. There was no disappointment in the gesture. It was simply a moment passed through. The way the cat would blink slowly in his direction, then return to dreaming. The way he could sit, warmed by tea and feline stillness, and feel no urge to move. We were both exactly where we needed to be. The page smelled faintly of tea. A cat hair stuck to the corner. He left it there. Not everything required tidying, and not every kind of company needed to speak to be known. He found himself smiling, not at the rejection, but at the clarity. It was a surprise, but not a dramatic one. The weight was light, the warmth immediate. He remained still, hands folded. The moment stretched, full and soundless. He did not shift. He did not speak. He simply allowed it to be. The memory lodged itself gently in his thoughts, not with sharpness, but as something folded like linen stored away for years. Breathing gently, letting the world carry on without him. And in that simple surrender, he found the calm he had not known he needed, a memory of peace without grandeur. The hum of evening blended with the sound of his breath and Pierre's slow purring. Not everything offered must be accepted. Not everything refused was personal. The name suited the cat. There was something contemplative about Pierre, as though he, too, was taking a holiday from obligation. The sky held that uncertain hue of blue-gray that suggested stillness more than any forecast. The tulips had begun to open more fully, their colors shifting subtly in the light. Pierre walked ahead, tail high, pausing occasionally as if to ensure he was still following. The silent companionship felt profound. Nothing needed to be said, nothing demanded. For so long, his movements had echoed across continents, his presence announced by trumpets and feared by nations. But Pierre asked nothing of him, did not require greatness, did not flinch at humility. The cat's contentment with simplicity gave shape to his own, a mirrored solitude that no longer felt like absence. When the sun fell on the kitchen tiles, Pierre sprawled across the warmest square. The silence was slightly different. He sat longer at the window, fingers tracing the rim of his teacup, gaze drifting across the empty sill. He did not worry. Cats were creatures of rhythm, and rhythm sometimes required pauses. The air was still, the garden unchanged, but something was subtly missing. When shadows lengthened along the bookshelf, Pierre followed. There was a grace in the cat's stillness that mirrored his own newfound quiet. He leapt onto the sill, curled once and settled. All was as it had been. The sense of continuity pleased him. Not everything needed reinvention. Some things, like companionship, could simply resume. It was a quiet reminder that the world carried on its own pace, unaffected by expectation. He sipped his tea slowly and watched the steam curl upward in quiet spirals, allowing the day to stretch open, unhurried. Pierre arrived early today, sat by the geraniums and blinked slowly. Or Pierre did not come. Wind must be from the north. These small entries felt more like observations of weather than of animals. Pierre was not a pet. Pierre was presence. It was then, in the quiet pause between thoughts, that he noticed the faintest sound of paws on stone. The cat made no effort to enter. It simply sat, calm and observant, its eyes reflecting the pale sky. There was a curious familiarity in its posture, as if it too had once commanded silence and now merely observed it. He returned its gaze, nodding once in acknowledgment. The cat did not respond, and that felt strangely appropriate. In time, the cat began to visit regularly, never with fanfare or demand. Pierre became part of the rhythm of his days. He noticed the way the cat moved with the light, chasing it from room to room without effort. He began to write about Pierre in his notebook, not in great detail, but as small footnotes at the edges of longer reflections. One morning, after placing a saucer of milk on the windowsill, he sat and watched Pierre approach. That day, he did not write strategies. He drew instead. In the evenings, Pierre would sometimes follow him as he strolled through the garden. When Pierre disappeared for a day, he noticed the absence not as loss, but as a missing note in a familiar melody. Pierre returned the next day, as if no gap had occurred. No apology, no celebration. The longer he spent in Pierre's quiet orbit, the more he understood the luxury of being unnoticed. He began to think differently about legacy. Perhaps it was not the monuments built or the borders redrawn, but the comfort of small moments shared without performance. One evening, as the garden turned gold and the shadows reached long and low, Pierre climbed into his lap. Later that night, as the stars appeared faintly beyond the chimney lines, he noted in his book, "Pierre joined me in silence." Pierre would return again, and again after that. But this particular evening, this quiet hour shared between a former emperor and a gray-furred shadow remained whole, untouched by time. And as he drifted into sleep that night, he imagined himself not as a figure of history, but simply a figure beside a cat. The morning opened slowly, as if the sky itself was uncertain whether to brighten or to pause. Pale light crept gently through the lace curtains, illuminating the edges of the small room with a muted glow. He rose without urgency, drawn by a stillness that had become familiar. Outside, the tulips swayed lightly, their petals glistening with the softness of dew. Today, he lowered himself onto its wooden surface, feeling the smoothness worn by weather and time. The flowers surrounded him like a quiet audience, uninterested in history. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of demand. The tulips did not ask to be admired. They were not cultivated to impress. They bloomed because it was their time. That simplicity humbled him. He had spent years calculating outcomes, maneuvering pieces across maps. Yet none of that had ever felt quite like this soft unfolding of color in the morning air. He folded his hands in his lap and let his eyes settle on a single bloom, crimson at the tips, fading to orange below. Fields that had withered under the thunder of boots and cannons. The shadows of the flowers stretched across the path like gentle brushstrokes. The child pointed at the garden, and continued on without pause. He smiled. The tulips had been noticed. That was enough. No monument would rise here. No speech would be given. And yet the moment had occurred, unrecorded, except in the whisper of petals and the flick of a sleeve. He closed his eyes briefly and felt the heat of the sun behind them. He imagined how different things might have been if he had learned to pause sooner. The day was not for regret. It was for stillness, for noticing, for allowing. A petal drifted onto his lap, and he let it stay there, curling faintly at the edges, catching the last of the sun. He picked it up gently and set it on the bench beside him, a tiny keepsake without burden. If he had looked upon fields not as territory, but as earth, if he had seen flowers not as symbols of victory, but as invitations to witness, these thoughts did not carry weight. They floated. When he opened them again, the garden remained. Quiet, unchanged. Enough. Only one line. Today, I looked at tulips and thought of nothing else. He closed the book without a sound and rested it beside the bed. The moonlight filtered in gently. He sank into the covers, letting the memory of petals and peace carry him into sleep. Time moved not in hours here, but in hues. The joints in his knees clicked faintly. He did not mind. The garden, too, would rest soon. The tulips would close. Then, without ceremony, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with the softest of sounds. And the tulips, as always, remained. The air would cool. He walked slowly back toward the house, pausing once more at the gate to look back. He began to write, slowly, the lines uneven. The ink dried fast in the rising warmth. Perhaps the greatest triumph is learning to sit still in the presence of life. He paused, crossed out the last word, rewrote it, beauty. He folded the note and placed it beside him on the bench, letting it rest in the sun. The irony did not escape him. Here, among blossoms and bees, he found the kind of reverence that never came with parades. The tulips did not announce their beauty. They just were. He did not feel sadness at their fading. Their impermanence gave them meaning. In every cycle of bloom and fall, there was a lesson in surrender, a kind of wisdom that did not come from books or battles. The garden taught without speaking. They whispered, if they could whisper at all, of peace. It reminded him of sunsets glimpsed through war smoke. And yet, here, it was only a flower. Each one seemed to stretch not toward conquest, but toward the light, unafraid and uncomplicated. Occasionally, a breeze would lift the tulip petals, making them flutter like small flags of peace. A butterfly landed on his sleeve and rested there, undisturbed. Its rust-red chest puffed and settled. He followed its progress with soft eyes, neither expecting nor interpreting. It was simply part of the landscape, a companion in calm. He found himself silently thanking it for its company, though no words passed between them. In earlier days, he might have brushed it away without thought. Today, he remained still, allowing its wings to settle. He stepped into the garden, boots soft on the earth. There was no destination, no pressing need to examine the terrain. There was no counting of steps, no path mapped in advance. Just the easy unfolding of movement. The petals moved gently with the air, never straining, never rushing. He looked at them, not for utility or strategy, but simply for what they were: alive, delicate, sufficient. The air was crisp and neutral, not yet warm, but not unfriendly either. His coat caught the breeze and fluttered slightly behind him. The rows of tulips, once a sea of indistinguishable green, now stood proud in their varieties: scarlet, yellow, violet, and pink. Each bloom held its own moment. He walked between the beds of flowers as one might stroll through memories, slowly and without aim. There was a bench near the back of the garden, one he had passed each day without sitting. He watched bees drift lazily from petal to petal, drawn not by ambition, but by instinct. Their presence calmed him. There was no need to perform, no need to explain. The sun warmed his shoulders and made shadows out of his folded legs. He let the breeze comb gently through his hair, and for a time did not think. It was a stillness that required no justification. What struck him most was the quiet. He thought about the fields he had marched through in his past. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a folded slip of paper, his notebook, carried more for habit now than for necessity. As the day passed, he remained, not idle, but present. He noticed how some tulips had already begun to wilt, their heads bowing, petals curling inward. A robin hopped along the edge of the flower bed, pecking gently at the earth. By afternoon, the light had shifted, growing softer and deeper. A small child passed by the fence, perhaps from the neighboring house. He leaned back on the bench, hands resting at his sides, palms open. But he did not dwell. As the light faded into the gentler hues of evening, he rose from the bench with care. He took one final breath of the flower-sweet air, letting it settle deep within him. That night, in his journal, he wrote no plans. The day began not with ambition, but with stillness, the kind that hummed gently beneath the walls of the quiet house. Outside, the trees shifted slowly in the breeze, their branches swaying like thoughtful fingers brushing over old stories. The air was soft with the scent of cooling brick and early morning flowers, the sort of aroma that asked nothing but noticed everything. The poet wandered in slowly, letting his feet find their own rhythm on the worn path. He chose a patch of grass by the tulips and lowered himself with care. The poet, now lying fully on his back, had let the notebook fall beside him. When he opened his eyes again, the poet was asleep, the notebook rising gently with each breath. A bee moved from one bloom to the next with delicate precision. A shadow passed overhead, cast by a slow-moving bird. He let these things happen, let them exist without recording or naming. It was enough to witness. The emperor smiled, not in amusement, but in shared understanding. He sat up slowly, blinking into the light, brushing pollen from his sleeves. They did not speak. The moment did not require it. The ground was cool beneath him, the sky open above. He folded his hands on his chest and let his thoughts flutter without urgency. He remembered nothing in particular. The air hummed. A bird chirped once, then grew silent. His entry was brief. A man came today. He slept by the tulips. I understood. When he finally rose, he felt neither stiff nor tired, only balanced. He did not record the moment. Did not need to. The earth had kept the shape of his rest, and that was enough. He placed the journal back on the table and sat by the fire as it crackled softly. It sat untouched, but its presence warmed the table. He only remembered the hush of afternoon, the weightless company of someone who had arrived without question and left without conclusion. In a world once defined by declarations, this small silence felt revolutionary, and in it he found peace once more. Companionship, he thought, was not always physical. Sometimes it was simply the memory of shared quiet. And in that memory, a former emperor and a wandering poet shared something that history never wrote down. The warmth seeped into his bones, and the quiet returned to its usual depth. The poet retrieved his notebook, opened it briefly, and made a single mark, a line, perhaps, a fragment. Then he stood, bowed slightly, and made his way to the gate. He resumed his walks, his tea, his silent meals. Yet something in him had slightly shifted, a small rearrangement of the inner furniture. The poet's nap, so simple, had left behind a kind of permission to rest fully, to pause without apology. Sleep, he thought, was the most honest form of reflection. In sleep, there was no performance, no defense, no pretense. There was a place in the grass slightly flatter than the rest, a petal that had clung to a sleeve left behind on the bench. He noticed these details not with longing, but with recognition. Moments, like people, did not need permanence to matter. Just surrender. He blinked slowly, as if unsure whether to stay awake or drift off. The emperor lowered himself to the bench nearby, close but not intruding. He closed his eyes and listened to the breeze folding through the garden, to the far-off rustle of kitchen pans, to the soft exhale of someone at rest. The notebook remained closed in his lap. The emperor watched from a distance, returning to his seat by the window. Through the thin glass, the presence of another did not disrupt the quiet. It folded into it, like another layer of calm. He sat in the corner chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, sipping a weak blend of herbal tea. No plans, no directives, no commands. Only the open passage of time. A gentle knock arrived at the door, some time after the tea had cooled. It was the sort of knock that neither demanded nor hesitated. When he answered, the figure before him was thin, wrapped in a shawl too large for his frame, a notebook tucked under one arm. The man introduced himself not as a poet, but simply as someone who walked and noticed things. He had heard the emperor was resting here. He said he brought no questions, only curiosity. Permission to sit in the garden and think. The invitation required no discussion. He stepped aside and motioned toward the garden gate. Hours passed without a word spoken. A poet wrote a little, looked up often. His eyes moved with the wind, tracking invisible lines across the sky. At one point, he stretched out fully on the lawn, arms behind his head, gaze unfixed. The emperor took his tea outside then, walking slowly with the cup in hand, pausing beside the tulips. They both nodded, a wordless greeting, and resumed their stillness. Nothing more was needed. Eventually, the sun settled high above, its light warm but not harsh. Time loosened its grip. Minutes fell like petals, light and inconsequential. He remained on the bench, not wanting to disturb the peace that had formed like mist around the garden. When the poet stirred, the sun had already begun its descent. That evening, as the light turned amber and the garden folded into dusk, the emperor returned to his journal. In the days that followed, the poet did not return. But the shape of his visit lingered, not as absence, but as residue. The house remained quiet. The garden continued its slow bloom. And so, one afternoon, with no particular intention, he lay down beside the tulips himself. He stayed there until the light dimmed, until the house behind him became a silhouette. Later that evening, he brewed a pot of tea and left a second cup out, just in case. That night, as sleep returned, he did not count victories or name regrets. Morning arrived like a whisper, filtering through curtains in pale ribbons of light. The house remained quiet, undisturbed, as if it too had learned the rhythm of rest. The ink smudged slightly beneath his fingers. Across the front page, a headline read, "Emperor on leave, Europe in suspension." Below it, subheadings speculated on implications, motives, and theories, none of them rooted in fact. The text weaved through tangled paragraphs of uncertainty. Eyes in capitals across the continent strained to interpret the stillness. Outside, the garden seemed to pause in mid-bloom, neither hurried nor halted. It was simply a day, one that would pass without urgency, without proclamation, without edges. In London, pamphlets speculated on coded messages hidden in the silence. Some claimed he was preparing a naval maneuver. Others wondered if he had gone mad. One diplomat noted, with concern, that peace itself might be his tactic. That calm could be a weapon. A day made of leaves, of warmth, of unmarked time. As he sat on the veranda, warmed by mid-morning light, he folded a corner of the newspaper and tucked it under a clay pot. It would dry there, and later he might use it to line a drawer or wrap a tulip bulb. For now, its noise belonged to another place, one he no longer inhabited. Ducks drifted close to the bank, and then away again. A cyclist passed behind him with a soft clatter of gears. Time moved, but it did not insist. It passed like water under the surface of thought. On the windowsill, a vase of wilting flowers leaned slightly to one side. He thought about replacing them, but chose instead to watch the petals curl inward. They were beautiful in retreat, too, The soft collapsing of life had its own dignity. He caught glimpses of the notices as he walked by a recital on Thursday. The price of onions, a clipping of that same headline. Emperor on leave. He stared at it long enough for thought to unravel. He placed the folded newspaper in the drawer beside the cutlery, buried beneath a cloth napkin. It would not be reread. The newspaper remained folded in his coat pocket, untouched since morning. He nodded politely. The emperor watched the lamplight flicker to life, one after another, like stars being pinned to the sky by hand. Shadows lengthened and settled. The tulips lifted their heads gently toward the morning sun, and the air settled over the rooftops with a hush. It was a morning shaped not by event, but by gentle presence, the kind that brushes the skin without stirring the mind. Just enough and nothing more. And yet the day was full. They had grown used to him as a quiet man in a dark coat who bought bread and always returned the basket. Children waved from doorways, and he lifted a hand in response. He only offered a small nod, and the man laughed quietly, returning to the board. The house sank into its nighttime quiet, and the garden sighed into darkness, tulips folding gently into themselves. Somewhere far away, men might still be speaking his name in anxious tones. But here, in this small world, the silence remained unbroken. Nothing more was said. No clarifications, no declarations. Just acknowledgment, brief and sufficient. A woman hung laundry near the bakery and called her cat back inside. The cobbles beneath his feet felt warm. At the breakfast table, he unfolded the newspaper that had arrived by courier, the only thread that connected this place to the distant thrum of the wider world. The moment passed like many others here, soft, brief, unrecorded. He watched a shadow slide across the grass, cast by a cloud that moved like thought, slow, shifting, without need to settle. He blinked slowly. The words felt heavier than they looked. They did not shout, but they implied a kind of confusion, even disapproval. The article speculated in long, careful sentences. What did his absence mean? What were his intentions? Did his silence mask something vast and imminent? Diplomats debated, scribes drafted scenarios, and generals waited, maps out, orders paused mid-air. But there was nothing beneath it. No code in the message, no strategy in the pause. Just stillness. Just a man seated with a bowl of porridge, watching light move across a wooden table. The spoon lay undisturbed. He sipped tea, then poured another cup, and turned the page to read about the weather in Vienna. The words floated over him without landing. Somewhere in the margins of that page, a note from the editor posed the question, can an empire rest? He turned another page and let the speculation drift out the window like smoke from a candle just extinguished. He set the paper down beside his plate, where steam rose from the modest bowl. He did not answer. There was no answer to give. It was not a riddle, not a strategy, not even a challenge. Elsewhere in Europe, rumors ran wild. In Vienna and Berlin, military councils held secret meetings. The absurdity of that notion amused him in a quiet way. In the garden, a bumblebee hovered close to his elbow. He did not move. The bee circled and continued on. Toward afternoon, he walked through the village. People nodded as he passed. No one saluted. No one bowed. Outside the post office, a group of men stood clustered, reading the town bulletin board. One man turned to him with a half-smile, as if to ask whether it was true. Later, he sat near the canal, watching the water fold and unfold like a lazy ribbon. The canal reflected the sky so clearly that it became difficult to distinguish where one began and the other ended. Back at the house, the cat Pier slept in a sun-warmed patch of floor. Its tail twitched once, then stilled. As evening approached, the lamplighter walked past the gate, lifting his long pole to coax fire into the glass lanterns. He returned indoors and prepared a simple supper: bread, cheese, a handful of roasted nuts. That night, his journal entry was brief. The world wonders. I watched ducks. He paused, then added a second line. No trumpet sounded. He closed the book and turned down the lamp. And for the first time in a very long time, that silence felt like an answer. Not one demanded, not one explained. Morning returned with the gentlest touch, like fingers brushing over still water. The light was muted, softened by a veil of cloud, and the air smelled faintly of yesterday's rain. The buttons slipped through their loops with ease, and his boots fit more loosely now. He had walked enough for them to mold to his feet. She had dark curls and a green ribbon tied at her collar. Her steps were hesitant, but her eyes held curiosity. A drawing, done in bold strokes with bright colors. He recognized himself vaguely, wearing a hat that tilted sideways. Around him were flowers, birds, and what appeared to be a loaf of bread. The light had shifted again, casting a silver sheen across the petals. Bees moved from flower to flower with the same calm rhythm he had come to know in himself. In the quiet, he remembered the many faces he had seen filled with expectation. He swept the porch, dusted a few shelves, and sliced an apple to share with Pierre, who sniffed it, declined, and returned to sleep. No battles were planned, no messages sent. He let the hours fold one over the next, like linens placed gently in a drawer. He filled the kettle and reheated the last of the tea, watching steam drift like a slow-moving cloud. Now there were none, only his own breath, the hum of bees, and the memory of a question. He felt a quiet comfort growing in that space, something beyond rest. Perhaps it was acceptance, or perhaps it was simply the absence of needing to be seen. He reached into his coat and drew out the child's drawing, unfolding it along the creases. Dreams came gently, like petals falling in slow motion, and the house, wrapped in night, held him softly. Its colors looked more vivid in the sun, and the paper rustled softly like a whispered conversation. With slow care, he added it to the pages of his journal, between a note about tulip roots and a recipe for lavender biscuits. The glow flickered across the walls, dancing over the edges of books and the rim of a teacup. In the low light, he wrote just one sentence in the journal. A child asked me if I was important. I think today I was. Not to preserve it as history, but to let it live among the things that mattered now, small, kind, ordinary moments. He noted that it had come without ceremony, without demand, and that was its grace. The child had captured peace in her own language. A crooked smile lifted his lips, not from amusement, but from gratitude. She looked up at him with the uncomplicated boldness only children possess. The child skipped back toward the schoolhouse, her ribbon bouncing. It joined his quiet collection of objects that held no title, only presence. He sat for a while with tea cooling in his hands, the cup cradled in palms more used to weight than warmth. Everything curved. Even the birds flew in lazy loops. There was no straight path in the picture, only softness. It reflected the day, and perhaps reflected him. A man in a crooked hat, picking flowers, surrounded by space that asked for nothing. He set it down on his knee and closed his eyes. Outside, a bird tapped briefly at the window, then flew off, leaving only the sound of wings. He watched her go, then resumed his walk, slower now. Something about the question lingered, not in discomfort, but in wonder. What did it mean to be important here? To whom? And why? Perhaps the world no longer expected anything of him, and in that release, he had become something quieter. Then, in a soft voice, she asked, "Are you someone important?" With a scarf draped lightly around his neck, he stepped outside into a garden softened by dew. Tulips bowed gently under the weight of moisture, and the hedges shimmered like they held secrets. The scent of earth and new blossoms filled the air like an invisible lullaby. It was a day that asked for nothing but observation. No task demanded completion. No letter waited to be written. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb the sleeping cat curled at the foot of the bed. He studied her face for a moment, not to gauge expectation, but simply to share the quiet. Then he shook his head gently and replied, "I was once. Today, I'm just someone who likes the garden." The room held warmth, both from the fire's memory and the stillness within the walls. He took his time dressing, layering against the coolness that lingered. His walk took him past the small schoolhouse, where children's laughter floated over the fence. The sound did not jar him. Instead, it folded into the day's quiet. The worn cobblestones felt familiar beneath his boots, as if remembering him from the day before. Near the bakery, he paused to greet the owner with a nod. The woman behind the counter offered him a small loaf wrapped in paper. He accepted it with a smile and dropped a coin into the jar by the door. Nothing was said, and nothing needed to be. As he turned to walk back, a child approached. He paused, not because the question was difficult, but because it was rare to be asked something so small and so vast all at once. She smiled as though that answer pleased her and handed him a folded piece of paper. He accepted it with care, tucking it carefully into his coat. Back at the cottage, he placed the drawing on the mantel, beside a pinnacone and a small shell he had found near the canal. Later, he brought a chair into the garden and sat beneath the sycamore tree. Looking at it now, he noticed how none of the lines were sharp. The warmth of the sun pressed gently on his eyelids. The rest of the day moved without urgency. As the sun began its descent, he returned to the mantel and held the drawing again. That night, he lit a candle instead of the lamp. He paused, then added a second sentence. "And I hope I remember the feeling longer than I remembered the titles." The candle burned low as he slipped into sleep, the drawing safe beside him, the quiet unfolding once more. Morning arrived with a low hush of mist moving through the streets. The windows of the cottage were blurred by a fine breath of condensation, and beyond them, the rooftops at Bruges seemed dipped in quiet. It was a morning that held no intention, just a soft, expansive stillness, wide enough to stretch time without breaking it. The quiet wrapped the town in folds of gentleness, muffling even the steps of the milk cart as it creaked along the cobbled road. Every breath felt deliberate, every motion slow and rooted. He sat for a while at the kitchen table, watching steam rise from his cup and circle itself back into the air. The scent of warm grain and faint citrus drifted from the tea. The house made no demands. Outside, the cat slept beneath the lilac bush, its tail curled like punctuation on a sentence already ended. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang not to summon, but to remind. It marked the hour without urgency. He noted it without rising. The day would unfold when it was ready. Later that day, he wandered without direction. His steps took him down a lane lined with ivy-draped fences and the worn thresholds of quiet houses. He passed a shop that sold wooden spoons, another that offered lace. Then, at the corner where the canal met a narrow bridge, he noticed a weathered sign, "Local History Museum." The sign swung slightly in the breeze, its paint faded, but still clear. There was something charming about how it waited to be noticed. Door opened with a creak that seemed more habit than complaint. Inside, the air was dry and smelled faintly of dust and polished wood. Light filtered in through tall windows, touching glass cases and aging portraits. He stepped quietly across. The floorboards, each one offering a soft echo of presence. The rhythm of his steps blended into the hush of the museum, a space designed more for reflection than for movement. There were exhibits of farming tools, hand-woven garments, faded ledgers, a pair of shoes worn down at the heel, photographs of river festivals and handwritten programs for seasonal fairs, a child's toy horse carved from pine. He moved from one display to the next, pausing to read small placards in careful handwriting. Time had been preserved here, not in triumph, but in usefulness. Each artifact was a quiet testament to lives lived gently. He wandered further into the building, expecting at some point to see his own name, a medal, a map, a reference to the many days that had once turned on his decisions. But room after room yielded nothing, not a plaque, not a sketch, not a mention. There were no portraits, no swords, no strategy maps drawn in chalk. The absence grew more apparent with each step dotted first. The absence puzzled him, but it was not a wound. It was a relief, slow and spreading. He breathed more deeply, as though space had expanded. Here he was not expected to explain, not expected to inspire. He was just another visitor on a day shaped by curiosity and quiet. In the absence of recognition, he found the presence of peace. It was as though history had made room for him to become invisible and free dot in one corner, near a window framed. By climbing ivy sat a display titled Everyday Lives. It included a teapot, a pair of mittens, and a shopping list scrawled in pencil on the back of a bread wrapper. He stared at it for some time. These objects had been held, used, not remembered, in the usual way, but lived. The list included apples, flour, eggs, and matches a glimpse into a day that likely seemed ordinary to someone and now rested quietly in glass. He sat on a bench near that display, letting the quiet settle over him. Somewhere nearby, a clock ticked with a wooden rhythm. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen, to let time pass without being measured. The museum continued around him, unchanged by his presence. It existed not to honor conquest, but to cradle routine. After a while, he rose and returned to the front desk. There was a small gift shelf beside it, stocked with postcards, pins, and miniature replicas of windmills. He selected a magnet shaped like a waffle and a small ceramic cup painted with tulips. The man behind the counter wrapped them slowly, saying nothing beyond a nod of acknowledgement. The exchange felt more like a ritual than a transaction. He stepped back into the street, where the sky had cleared and the stones beneath his feet held the warmth of midday. In one hand, he carried a paper bag, and in the other, a small pamphlet from the museum. It flapped slightly in the breeze. A family passed by speaking softly. A dog trotted behind. The world felt in rhythm with itself. At home, he placed the magnet on the cottage's icebox. It clicked into place beside a note reminding him to water the herbs. The cup he filled with wildflowers from the canal path, not arranged, just placed, like thoughts gathered loosely in the mind. Their colors were soft but cheerful. They sat by the window, catching the afternoon light. He sat near the window as afternoon passed, the pamphlet open on his lap. The cover bore the museum's name in faded ink. He traced it with one finger, then folded it neatly and placed it inside his journal. Pages thick with pressed petals and fragments of days. This too would become a memory, held gently. That evening he wrote a new entry. Today I visited a museum and was not remembered. It was the kindest thing the world has done for me in some time. His pen paused mid-sentence. He stared out the window, the sun now a pale coin low in the sky. Shadows grew longer, but not darker. He continued, "Let others carry the weight of legacy. I will carry the weight of bread and teacups." He set the pen aside. A small breeze stirred the curtain. Pierre stretched and leapt onto the windowsill, his paws resting beside the vase. He sniffed the flowers once and blinked as if approving. The cat curled at his feet as he set the journal aside. The fire was low but steady. The garden outside had quieted. He listened to the sound of his own breath. It came easily now, like the turning of a page no longer burdened with narrative. There were no horns of triumph, no statues carved in stone, only the hush of twilight and the dignity of small things. And as night crept in through the windows, he felt light. Not from having done much, but from having been in a place that asked nothing more. He lit a candle and watched the flame flicker. It did not shout, did not proclaim. It simply burned. That was enough. The morning arrived quietly, with a hush. So deep it seemed to have rolled in from the distant sea. The sky above Bruges wore a coat of pale pewter, and the garden beyond the window was traced in soft grays and greens. A light mist clung to the petals of tulips, and the breeze that moved among them made no more sound than the stroke of a feather. He stirred slowly, blinking into the gentle light, the warmth of the blanket still holding him in a half-dashed dream. By the hearth, a single ember still glowed. He added a stick of kindling and watched it catch. The flames crept upward as if rising not from urgency, but from a quiet memory of warmth. The kettle was filled and placed above the flame. Its gentle bubbling was the morning's only declaration. Pierre, already awake, had taken his post by the window, watching the garden with unblinking patience. He sat with a slice of toast, slightly uneven, from a knife that had dulled with use. He did not mind. The crust was darker than usual, but the taste was simple and satisfying. Without thinking, he reached for a pencil, and finding none within reach, picked up the crust instead. Something about its rough texture and browned surface called to him. With a steady hand and a spark of absurd amusement, he began to etch the toast with the edge of a spoon. The marks were faint, but visible lines and loops, the beginnings of a thought. It was not a journal entry, not really. Just a shape of the moment, a shadow of an idea left behind on something meant to be eaten. The rest of the slice became his. Page. On it, he marked the number of tulips blooming that morning, noted the weight of mist on the hedge, and captured the way Pierre blinked slowly when the kettle whistled. When the toast was full, he laid it down beside his empty plate, not to discard it, but to preserve it. In the quiet cottage, it became something sacred in its silliness. Later, he gathered more toast and tried again. This time, he scraped gently with a blunt knife, creating soft imprints along the edge. He traced the shape of a bird he had seen. In the garden, a sparrow, or something like it, and below it, wrote a phrase he liked, "A morning is enough." The act required more attention than usual writing, and in that he found a peace. Each movement had weight. Each word emerged slowly, like mist from the canal. He arranged the finished pieces on a shelf beside the window, careful not to disturb. The crumbs. They rested like relics, a small, crumbling archive of his stillness. In another life, he might have called them dispatches or strategy notes. But here, they were crusts with thoughts carved into them. No audience, no purpose, no permanence. Just presence. Afternoon passed in quiet rhythm. He swept the porch. He watched bees drift from flower to flower. He reheated the tea and sipped it slowly, then sat again with a new piece of toast. This one held a brief description of the way. Light pooled on the garden path, and a single word written sideways, lavender. Pierre meowed once in approval, or maybe in request, then returned to his sunlit spot. The house seemed to nod along with the rhythm of the day, each room glowing faintly with comfort. The bread crust journals, as he had begun to think of them, grew in number. Some were plain, others etched with care, and all of them unnecessary. In the most wonderful way, he began selecting slices of bread, not for reading, but for writing. The heel of the loaf made a good surface. Whole wheat offered better contrast. He experimented with patterns, spirals, lines, dots, and when they broke or flaked apart, he did not mind. He started over. Every failure was quiet and forgivable. In the late afternoon, he bundled a few of the sturdier pieces in cloth and placed them in a small tin box. Not to preserve them forever, but just until the mood passed. He knew their time was short, that eventually they would dry or crumble, and that too was part of their charm. The impermanence made them gentle, made them real. As the sun lowered itself toward the rooftops, he wrote a final entry on a slice with an unusually smooth surface. Today I made no plan and followed it completely. He placed it on a windowsill where the light touched it, the crust-glowing hammer in the golden hour. It looked like a tiny monument, a toast to quiet, if there was such a thing. Evening gathered slowly, like a shawl pulled over the shoulders of the house. He made a simple supper and left the dishes for later. The fire was coaxed back into life, and he sat beside it, hands folded loosely in his lap. The tin box rested on the table nearby. Pierre had curled into the corner of his armchair, a silent witness to the day. He didn't write in his regular journal that evening. He felt no need. The crust said enough. They carried the softness of the day in ways paper could not. In them were woven the quiet chuckles of a man who had once held empires and now held breadcrumbs. A man who, in carving nonsense onto breakfast, found meaning without message. The candle flickered as he nodded off. The last of the toast cooled and resting. And in that soft, absurd, beautiful practice, the day became whole. The morning came with a hush that barely stirred the curtains. The sky had taken on the soft blue of a faded tapestry, and the air held the gentle promise of warmth. He moved slowly through the early moments, lighting the fire, filling the kettle, and brushing the crumbs from yesterday's toast journal into a small jar. Outside, dew lingered on the leaves as if reluctant to move on. He spent the morning watering the garden, his hands cool with moisture and his sleeves damp where they brushed the mint and thyme. The lavender was in bloom, its tall stems stretching in lazy arcs, pale purple blossoms catching the sunlight in a way that made the entire bed seem to hum. He paused often to admire them, watching bees hover like thoughts, never quite settling. It was there, among the rows of fragrant stems, that he heard footsteps. Not the soft tread of a neighbor or the scuffle of a child, but the crisp, measured gait of boots long trained to march. He turned slowly and saw a young soldier standing by the gate, helmet tucked beneath one arm, face uncertain in the light. Soldier did not speak. He stood stiffly, eyes scanning the cottage, the garden, the retired figure before him, as though expecting to see something more. A map table, a tent, an army. Instead, there were flowers, a kettle whistling in the distance, a cat slinking through sunlight. Nothing more. With a quiet nod, the visitor stepped forward, passing through the gate and down the path where petals brushed his trousers. The scent of lavender wrapped around him like a question with no urgency. The man watched as the soldier's posture slowly softened. The steel of command unwound, thread by thread. Beneath the sun, he gestured toward a bench beneath the old tree and sat down without waiting for reply. The soldier followed. They sat without speaking, and the silence grew not awkward but comfortable. Above them, birds made small sounds that drifted into the stillness. The garden breathed around them. The soldier seemed younger in the quiet. His face, once stern, took on the open softness of someone trying to understand. His hands, so used to holding rifle and ration, now rested lightly on his knees. The man beside him reached down and brushed a stray petal from his shoe. In time. The soldier looked around, as if cataloging the absence of urgency. There were no drills, no horns, no orders. Only sun, soil, and the faint creak of a wind-blown shutter. It was, perhaps, the first time he had stood in such a place without the gravity of war holding him upright. Eventually, a man rose and walked to the herb bed. He picked a handful of lavender, wrapped it in twine, and placed it gently in the eye. Soldier's hands. It was a gesture without explanation. The soldier looked at the bundle, as if unsure what it meant, but held it anyway. Then, with a small nod of thanks, he turned and walked away. Not quickly, not slowly, just with a quiet rhythm. That belonged more to this garden than to the parade grounds he had left behind. As he disappeared down the path, the cottage seemed to exhale. The man returned to his bench. Pierre leapt onto his lap, stretching luxuriously. The lavender swayed slightly in the breeze, their scent rising again now that the air was still. There was no sign that a visitor had come, save for a faint impression in the earth and a single dropped button. Later, he wrote in his journal, "A soldier arrived this morning, searching for orders. I gave him lavender. He left with fewer questions. I think that is enough." He tucked the button into a small box with other oddments: a pressed pedal, a broken spoon, a scrap of ribbon from a market stall. These were not treasures, but reminders, not of glory, but of grounding dot in the afternoon. He returned to the garden. With small shears, he trimmed the lavender and gathered what he could into a shallow basket. Some he laid on the window-sill to dry. Others he tied with twine and hung above the hearth. The room began to smell like memory, not of any specific moment, but of calmness itself. He brewed tea with a sprig of lavender tucked inside. The flavor was unfamiliar, but gentle. It made him pause between sips, and that, he thought, was the point: to make room for pause, to carve silence into the day where words were not needed. That evening, he sat on the porch and watched the sky change colors. The horizon held long bands of rose and peach, slowly deepening into a soft indigo. Fireflies blinked in the hedge. A cart passed far off in the distance, its wheels murmuring over stone. He held a warm cup in both hands and listened to the night. Arrive one sound at a time, Pierre chased a moth, then curled at his feet. The lavender swayed once more, as if waving good night. He had not spoken aloud since morning. His voice felt unnecessary. The quiet carried everything. Before bed, he placed a sprig of dried lavender inside his journal. It crumbled slightly at the touch, but left its scent behind. He breathed it in and smiled. "Let the world have its battles," he wrote. "Let it chase purpose across borders. Here I will plant lavender and wait for nothing." He closed the journal, slid it beneath his pillow, and turned out the light. The moon rose silently above the rooftops, and the garden folded into sleep. The morning unfolded slowly, like a page turned by a breeze. The sun rose with quiet grace, casting a muted golden wash over the cottage walls and spilling across the floor in thin bands. There was no urgency in its light, only a gentle invitation to notice. A kettle hummed low on the stove. Pierre stretched in a sun patch by the window, paws twitching faintly in a dream. The scent of thyme and hoar, wood smoke mingled in the air. He sat at the small wooden table with a piece of bread and a cup of lavender tea. The toast was unbuttered, but still warm, its simplicity matching the stillness of the hour. He chewed slowly, eyes resting on nothing in particular. After a while, he rose, rinsed the cup, and set it on the sill where it would catch the morning light dot in the washroom. He filled the basin with warm water. Steam curled gently upward, fogging the mirror. His reflection greeted him not with judgment, but curiosity. The face that looked back seemed unfamiliar in its quietness. A man who had not given orders, not plotted maps, not drawn lines across borders in some time. The angles of his cheekbones, the curve of his jaw, seemed less severe. The heaviness behind his eyes had softened. He dipped a cloth into the basin and pressed it to his face, letting the warmth sink in. His fingers moved slowly, thoughtfully. Each motion felt like the beginning of something, though he did not know what. He reached for the brush and the soap, lathering the bristles with careful circles. Foam rose in soft peaks, like clouds building across a calm sky dot. As he applied the lather, he watched his reflection blur and reform through the fogged mirror. It reminded him of the way time had softened his past, turned it into shapes and gestures. More than events. No battles rose to greet him now, no speeches or salutes. Only the slow drift of a razor blade along his cheek. He shaved without hurry, following the lines of his face as if discovering them for the first time. There was no strategy to this task, no preparation for anything beyond the moment. The sound of the blade against stubble was quiet, satisfying, almost meditative. A rhythm emerged. Scrape, rinse, breathe. Scrape, rinse, breathe. When he was done, he rinsed again, patted his face dry, and looked once more into the mirror. His skin was pink from the heat, smooth and calm. He looked ordinary, not lesser, but quieter. The kind of face that might pass unnoticed in a crowd or greet a neighbor without raising questions. It was a face at peace. He smiled softly and left the washroom. The day had thickened slightly, the air now full of bee-song and bird calls. Outside, the garden waited. He sat on the porch steps with a slice of melon and watched the light move across the stone path. There was nothing planned, and that was the plan. After a while, he fetched his journal. Not the crumb-covered one from the kitchen shelf, but the proper leather-bound book that held more structured thoughts. He opened to a blank page and wrote, "This morning, I shaved without a reason. My face is unfamiliar, and that feels right." He set the journal aside and watched Pierre chase a bug through the grass. The cat moved in jerky leaps, all mischief and concentration. The world was a series of small wonders. Each one needed only to be seen, not solved. Later in the day, he wandered into town. The streets were dappled with shadow, the air carrying the scent of fresh bread and tulip stems. At the corner, a vendor sold pastries dusted with sugar. He bought one and ate it slowly as he walked, each bite a kind of conversation with his senses. He passed the barber shop and looked in. The window was fogged slightly from within, and he could just make out the outline of a man being shaved. The barber moved with the same slow grace he had practiced that morning. He watched for a few minutes, then turned away, not out of disinterest, but because he had already experienced what he came to see. He returned home by way of the canal, where ducks moved with purpose that seemed at odds with their wobbling steps. Children threw bits of bread and squealed at the flurry of feathers. He paused at the bridge, leaning against the rail, and let the water carry his reflection downstream. In the afternoon, he trimmed the herbs, refilled the water pitcher, and brushed the lint from his coat. The motions were small, quiet, like punctuation, in a sentence that never needed to be spoken aloud. He folded the hand towel from the morning and set it on the radiator to dry. Its dampness held the shape of his hands. By sunset, the sky was a layered quilt of lavender, peach, and slate. He lit a single candle and watched its light flicker against the windowsill. The house had become a world of its own, complete without commentary. Outside, a breeze shifted the leaves just enough to make them whisper. That night, he returned to the washroom and glanced at his face in the mirror. The pinkness had faded, but the calm remained. He touched his jaw, felt the smoothness, and nodded to himself. There was no one to impress, no war to win, just skin and time and the quiet that lay between. He brushed his teeth, extinguished the candle, and slipped beneath the blanket. Pierre curled at his side, a soft weight of contentment. From outside came the rustle of night creatures, the low gurgle of the canal. He closed his eyes and listened to and as he drifted toward sleep, he thought not of battles, nor maps, nor empires, only of the blade sliding gently along his jaw, of the quiet surprise of his own reflection, of how sometimes even a face can forget its burdens, if given the chance to be still. The next morning drifted into being with the soft insistence of birdsong. and the faint clink of glass bottles being delivered somewhere nearby. The light came gently through the lace curtains, painting the floorboards with delicate shadows that shifted only when a breeze stirred the room. He woke without alarm or agenda, his thoughts as loose as threads in a summer breeze. The cat stirred beside him, blinked twice, then resumed its slow breathing, content to let the day shape itself. The rhythm of the house responded in kind, with a slow creak of wood and the ticking of a clock too. Shy to speak loudly, he moved through the morning rituals as if gliding. Water for tea, a crust of bread with a touch of soft cheese. The kettle gave its small, bubbling song. He sipped quietly by the window, watching the garden receive its share of sun. The mint and sage seemed taller today. A bee investigated this blossoms, then moved along without haste. The lemon balm swayed slightly under a lazy breeze. It was a morning made for stillness, and the stillness embraced him like a familiar companion. Later, he walked through the town, not to arrive anywhere, but simply to pass through. People had begun to recognize him, not with awe or suspicion, but with the soft familiarity reserved for someone who causes no ripples. He nodded gently to shopkeepers and mothers shepherding children. A small dog barked twice at him, then lost interest. A boy offered him a plum from a basket, and he accepted with a small smile. The world had adjusted to his presence, and in doing so had made room for his quiet dot at a modest bakery. He purchased a small loaf, still warm, and continued walking with it cradled in both hands. The scent followed him like a memory. Outside a cafe, an elderly man in a straw hat raised his cup in silent greeting. He nodded back. A pair of children passed him on scooters, their laughter trailing like ribbons. A postman whistled a slow tune. The town was awake, but unhurried, like a symphony with no crescendo, composed entirely of pauses and rests. By midday, he had arrived at the public square, a tidy open space where benches circled a modest fountain. He sat beneath a tree, the loaf half-eaten beside him, and closed his eyes. Around him the town breathed. A horse clip-clopped gently across the cobblestones. Church bells marked the hour, not as summons, but as punctuation. Someone dropped a coin into the fountain, and it landed with a musical plink. A local florist, arranging stems at her outdoor stall, glanced his way and smiled. She whispered to a passerby, who nodded knowingly. The name they had given him was passed quietly between people. Monsieur Pellicon, the little quiet man. It was spoken without mockery, perhaps even with affection. He did not correct them. The name was neither burden nor honor. It simply was. He remained in the square for some time. At one point, someone sat beside him on the bench. They did not speak. After a few moments, they stood again and walked away. It was enough, apparently, just to share the quiet. Leaves overhead rustled faintly, like pages of a book being turned. Without urgency. A breeze carried the smell of distant pastry, and his eyes fluttered shut again. That evening, he was invited to a gathering in the community hall. The note had been slipped under his door, written in gentle script. It was an invitation to une soirée du silence, an evening of silence. He arrived just before dusk, dressed simply, with clean boots and a brushed coat. He brought nothing but his presence and an open heart. The hall was lit with candles, their flames nodding lightly in the soft air. People sat on cushions and chairs, some with tea in their hands, others holding books they did not open. No one spoke. Music played faintly from a corner, not a melody, but tones that rose and fell like breath. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon and polished wood. Curtains swayed at open windows. The silence grew into a living thing. He found a seat near the back, beside an open window. Outside, the night had begun to settle in, the sky deepening to blue. The silence was not empty, but full. Every glance, every movement carried its own. Wait. Someone passed him a small plate of almond biscuits. He took one and passed the rest along. The biscuit was soft, fragrant with vanilla. It melted gently on his tongue. For over an hour, they sat together. There was no program, no speeches, only the rhythm of shared stillness. A child curled up in their mother's lap. A man removed his shoes and flexed his toes with quiet relief. A woman lit a second candle. The room held all of it without judgment. The silence was like music for those who knew how to listen. When the final candle was extinguished, people began to rise. Some embraced softly, others placed hands over hearts, or offered quiet nods. He remained seated for a few more minutes, watching the shadows rearrange themselves. The warmth of the group lingered like the last note of a lullaby dot as he left the hall. The air had cooled, and the sky shimmered faintly with stars. He walked home slowly, the gravel underfoot crunching softly. The moon rested above the rooftops, like a sentinel. When he reached the gate, Pierre was waiting, tail upright, eyes reflecting moonlight. Together, they entered the house. He placed the biscuit tin on the shelf, removed his boots, and lit a single candle. The flame glowed warmly against the wooden walls. He poured a cup of warm milk and sat by the window. His journal lay open but untouched. There was nothing more to say that night. Instead, he watched the wind stir the herbs on the sill. He breathed deeply. The silence of the gathering still echoed in his chest. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. It was the kind that made space for thought, for breath, for simply being. It was the kind that gathered you gently and reminded you that peace could be enough. Before sleep, he wrote a single line. In stillness, I found that I was not alone. Then he blew out the candle and slipped beneath the blanket, Pierre curling at his feet. The world outside whispered, but asked nothing. Sleep came like a tide, gentle and sure. The day began with the soft gray of overcast skies, the kind that seemed to muffle the world in a gentle hush. Rain had fallen during the night, and the scent of wet earth lingered in the air like a quiet memory. The garden glistened with droplets, each leaf a tiny mirror to the sky. He woke slowly, blinking at the dim light, the blanket pulled snugly around his shoulders. Pierre was already awake, perched on the windowsill, watching raindrops gather and fall with feline fascination. He sat up, stretched, and wandered into the kitchen. The kettle took longer than usual to boil, as if resisting the rush of expectation. He did not mind. He leaned against the counter, watching steam rise and curl like delicate handwriting. When it was ready, he poured the water into a chipped mug, the one with a small tulip painted on its side, and let the tea steep. It was a blend of herbs he'd purchased at the market the week before: lavender, lemon balm, and something unnamed the vendor had called restful green. He sipped the tea slowly. It was warm, but not hot. The flavor unfurled gradually, like a thought remembered just in time. It was not remarkable, but it was kind. The cup sat heavy in his hands, the warmth pressing gently against his palms. He sat at the table and looked out the window at the soft drizzle. No plans presented themselves. No urgency crept in. The rain had swept even the dust of intention away. With the cat watching, he opened a fresh page in his journal. He drew a slow line down the center, dividing it in two. On one side, he wrote victories, on the other, quiet. He stared at the headings for some time, then began listing moments from the past few days. The victories were odd: a well-sliced apple, a folded towel, a loaf of bread shared. The quiet side filled more quickly. The sound of wind and leaves, the coolness of the floor in the early morning, the way the tulips seemed to bloom a little more each day without asking for applause. When the page was full, he tore it out and folded it carefully into quarters. He placed it between the pages of an old novel that had been sitting untouched on the shelf, not as a message, but as a companion. The book would carry it forward in time, perhaps to be discovered someday when it was needed. Or perhaps not. That too was fine. By late morning, the rain had stopped, and the world seemed to breathe again. He stepped outside, the damp air soft on his skin, and walked barefoot across the garden path. The stones were cool and slick beneath his feet. He bent to examine a tulip that had bent under the weight of water. Gently, he cupped the bloom in his hands, lifted it, and shook the droplets free. The flower seemed to nod in return. He spent the next hour tending to the garden, not with purpose, but with presence. He plucked away leaves that had browned, rearranged stones that had shifted. He whispered a thank you to the time for its fragrance. Pierre supervised from the porch, tail flicking like a metronome. The world was full of small work and large stillness. Returning indoors, he decided to paint. It had been some years since he'd picked up a brush, but the idea came not as ambition, but as a suggestion. He gathered a few old supplies from the cupboard. A small set of watercolors, thick paper, and a single brush with slightly frayed bristles. He filled a bowl with water and sat near the window where the light was most generous. The first strokes were uncertain, but he did not mind. He let the colors speak in their own time. A blur of blue, a stroke of green, a curve that became a hill, then became nothing. He painted a cup of tea, a gray sky, a cat, a quiet man looking out a window. There were no masterpieces, only moments. When he was done, he set the paper aside to dry and rinsed the brush until the water ran clear. Lunch was simple: a wedge of cheese, a pear, a piece of bread still warm from the oven. He ate slowly, reading a passage from the book where he had hidden his folded journal page. The words on the page seemed less important than the rhythm of turning them. They fell into the room like petals in the afternoon. He napped on the couch. Pierre curled at his knees. Rain returned in soft pulses, tapping the windows like a lullaby. He dreamed of fields stretching endlessly, the sky above pale and kind. In the dream, he walked with no destination, his hands empty and light. When he woke, the rain had passed again, leaving everything washed and waiting. He stood at the threshold of the front door, letting the damp breeze pass through him. Evening light clung to the rooftops, and somewhere nearby, someone was baking. The scent of cinnamon and clove drifted toward him like a memory he hadn't made yet. He boiled water once more and made another cup of tea. This time it was cooler still. The flavor was subtle but comforting. He sat with it on the porch, Pierre in his lap, the journal beside him. He did not write. He simply held the cup and watched the sky deepen as twilight arrived. The tulips seemed to glow softly in the fading light. Birds rustled in the trees, settling for the night. He sipped the last of the tea, now tepid, and smiled. It was not the best cup he had ever had, but it was the most real. It had shared the day with him, slowly, kindly, without asking for more than his attention. He stood, stretched, and went inside. The candle was lit with a single match, and the flame danced gently on the tabletop. He sat again in stillness, Pierre, now nestled into a circle of fur at his feet. There was nothing left to do. The world had been enough. Before bed, he washed the cup, dried it, and set it upside down beside the sink. He brushed his teeth, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and closed his eyes. And that night, as he drifted into sleep, his last thought was not of strategy or greatness, or even peace. It was simply the echo of a cup of tea that had never been hot, but had somehow been just right. The final morning came like any other, hushed and unhurried. Light crept gently into the room, rushing across the wooden floorboards and climbing slowly up the walls. The window was slightly ajar, letting in a tender breath of cool air. Pierre had claimed the corner of the blanket again, curled into the shape of a soft gray question mark. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't beg to be broken. He rose with the same ease he had come to know during the week. The routine was familiar now. Water on the boil, the same mug on the counter, a gentle pinch of herbs. He didn't watch the clock. There was no appointment, no departure time marked. Only the rhythm of hands moving slowly, the creak of the old cabinet, and the gentle clink of spoon against porcelain. The tea was warm, its flavor unhurried. He drank it standing by the window, watching the tulips respond to the morning light. Some still held the memory of dew on their petals. Others had begun to lean gracefully, as if bowing to the passing of time. He said nothing, not even to Pierre. The stillness was too complete to be interrupted by thought. He moved through the house with soft steps, folding his few clothes, tucking the journal between pages of an old book he would leave behind. There were no souvenirs, only a folded handkerchief, still holding the scent of lavender, and a biscuit tin, now empty, but somehow heavier for the memory it carried. The garden received him one last time. He knelt to press his palm into the soil, then stood and looked around without searching. Each corner of the yard held some small offering of quiet. The place where the cat napped, the bent tulip, the trail of pebbles that led nowhere in particular. It was all still there, and it would remain so. He wrote a final line in his journal. Tomorrow, I am emperor again. But today, I am simply a man who drank tea and watched tulips bloom. He closed the book, placed it on the table, and did not take it with him that no one saw him leave. The door clicked shut as if exhaling. The street was quiet, the town not yet stirred into motion. Perhaps someone might notice the candle not lit that evening, or the absence of footprints in the morning dew. But no announcement was made, and no trace was needed. The house remained just as he had left it. A place briefly inhabited, gently touched, and lovingly departed. The chair by the window still faced the garden. The mug sat rinsed and upside down. A few crumbs from the last biscuit lingered beneath the table, waiting patiently for a breeze or a broom dot, and so the week passed into memory, without monument or proclamation. A week unwritten in the annals of empire, but quietly inscribed in the hush of a garden, the purr of a cat, and the steam of a not-so-hot cup of tea. That sometimes history forgets the most important days. It remembers battles, treaties, and crowns. But it rarely notes when someone chose to pause, to be still, to simply exist without intention. For 1 week, the Emperor of France did nothing. And in doing nothing, he rediscovered something quietly profound, that the world did not stop spinning. Armies did not fall apart. Borders did not collapse. In fact, for a short moment, even war seemed to forget its hunger. Napoleon, the man so often described in motion, had found rest. And the world, so used to his thunder, listened for once to his silence. There were no statues raised for this week, no songs composed or holidays named. But if you look closely, you might still find echoes of it, in the way a tulip leans toward light, or the way steam curls from a forgotten cup of tea. In the hush of an evening, where nothing happens, and that nothing is enough, it was a week, filled not with triumphs, but with tenderness. A loaf of bread, a cat named Pierre, a quiet gathering of townsfolk who asked nothing from him but presence. There was no glory in it, only grace, and perhaps that is what makes this moment unforgettable. Because if a man taught to conquer could learn to sit still, then perhaps we all can. If an emperor could rest, then so can we. So tonight, rest gently. Let the world turn without you for a while. Breathe in the silence. Trust the stillness. And when you wake, may you carry with you a little more quiet and a little less urgency. Sleep well.